Tonight, we journey into the shadows of history to uncover what life was truly like for a medieval knight. Forget the romanticized tales of gallant heroes and chivalrous adventures. The reality was a world of brutal training, crushing social expectations, constant violence, and a life expectancy that would horrify modern audiences. This is the story of Sir Aldric of Ravenshollow, whose journey from wide-eyed page to battle-scarred knight reveals the shocking truth about why being a medieval knight was far from the glamorous life we imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for. Before we begin this unprecedented exploration into one of history's most misunderstood professions, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Given that it's late in the evening and you're ready to unwind, I'll keep the opening brief. Make sure to dim your lights, and perhaps turn on a fan for some gentle background noise. Now let's descend into the harsh reality of medieval life. In the year 1247, in the rain-soaked lands of Grimthorne, a 7-year-old boy named Aldric was torn from his family's modest manor house. His father, Baron Roderick of Ravenshollow, had struck a deal with the powerful Duke Mortimer of Blackstone Keep. Young Aldric would serve as a page, beginning a journey that would strip away his childhood innocence and forge him into something society demanded but rarely appreciated, a medieval knight. The morning of his departure, Aldric clutched a wooden toy sword his father had carved for him, unaware it would be the last toy he'd ever own. His mother, Lady Isabel, wept quietly as she kissed his forehead, knowing she might not see her son for years, if ever again. This wasn't an adventure. It was a transaction, a cold exchange of a child's freedom for political alliance and social advancement. Blackstone Keep loomed before Aldric like a massive stone predator, its walls black with centuries of soot and weather. The castle wasn't the majestic fortress of fairy tales, but a grim military compound that reeked of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the metallic tang of blood from the practice yards. Here, childhood died quickly and brutally. As a page, Aldric's days began before dawn with the tolling of the chapel bell. His small hands, still soft from his mother's care, were immediately put to work carrying heavy buckets of water, scrubbing armour until his knuckles bled, and serving at tables where grown men discussed war and death as casually as others might discuss the weather. The romantic notion of pages learning to sing and dance was a luxury reserved for only the highest nobility. For most, like Aldric, it was pure drudgery. The other pages were his competition, not his friends. Food was scarce, and only the strongest and most cunning survived with their dignity intact. Aldric learned quickly that showing weakness meant becoming a target. Boys as young as 8 would fight viciously over scraps of bread or a warmer place to sleep. The strong preyed upon the weak with a cruelty that would make modern bullying seem gentle by comparison. Sir Gareth the Ironclad, the knight master responsible for training the pages, was a mountain of scarred flesh and barely contained violence. His teaching methods involved liberal use of wooden switches, iron-reinforced gloves, and psychological torture disguised as character building. "A knight who cannot endure pain," he would roar while beating a stumbling page, "is a knight who will die screaming on his first battlefield." The physical training was designed to break weak boys and forge the survivors into human weapons. Pages were forced to run in full armour through muddy fields until they collapsed from exhaustion. They practiced sword work with weapons heavier than what adults would use in actual combat, building strength through suffering. Aldric's shoulders ached constantly, his back was perpetually sore, and his hands became a map of blisters and calluses. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological torment. Pages were taught that their lives meant nothing compared to their duty to their lord. They were indoctrinated with the belief that dying gloriously in battle was preferable to living as a coward. Fear was beaten out of them, along with much of their humanity. The castle's chapel offered no refuge. The chaplain, Brother Mordecai, preached a religion of war and submission. God, according to his sermons, loved those who killed his enemies with righteous fury. Heaven awaited knights who died in battle, while those who showed mercy or retreated faced eternal damnation. Even spirituality became another tool of psychological conditioning. Aldric watched older boys graduate to become squires, only to return months later missing fingers, eyes or limbs from training accidents that were considered normal parts of the education process. Some didn't return at all. The Master-at-Arms would simply announce that Sir So-and-so has found his rest with God, and life would continue as if that boy had never existed. The food was deliberately poor. Stale bread, watery porridge, and meat so tough it was barely edible. This wasn't due to poverty, but philosophy. Hunger made boys aggressive and desperate, qualities considered essential for future warriors. Aldric learned to eat anything put before him without complaint, a skill that would serve him well in the lean years ahead. Winter at Blackstone Keep was particularly brutal. The stone walls provided little warmth, and pages slept on straw pallets that offered minimal protection from the cold. Frostbite was common, and several boys lost toes or fingers to the harsh conditions. The weak ones died of pneumonia or fever, their bodies simply unable to withstand the combination of cold, poor nutrition, and exhausting labour. As Aldric's first year at the keep drew to a close, he had transformed from an innocent child into something harder and colder. The boy who had cried for his mother was gone, replaced by a calculating young survivor who understood that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had learned the first and most important lesson of knighthood, that honour and glory were pretty words used to disguise a life of brutal servitude and endless violence. Little did he know that his ordeal as a page was merely the gentle introduction to a life that would demand everything from him, while offering very little in return. The path ahead would test not just his body, but his soul, in ways that would leave scars no armour could protect against. The journey into the dark reality of medieval knighthood has only just begun. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By his 14th year, Aldric had survived what many boys could not. The weak had been weeded out through disease, accident, or simply breaking under the relentless pressure. Those who remained were harder, meaner, and more desperate than when they'd arrived. Aldric's promotion to squire wasn't a reward, it was merely graduation to a more sophisticated form of torture. Sir Thaddeus Grimwald became Aldric's new master, a knight whose reputation for brutality preceded him like the stench of a corpse. Grimwald had earned his spurs in the bloodiest campaigns across the northern borderlands, and his face bore the scars of a dozen battles. More importantly, he bore the psychological scars of a man who had killed so often that human life had lost all meaning to him. The transition from page to squire marked the end of any pretense that this was about honour or nobility. Aldric's new duties were those of a personal servant to a professional killer. Each morning he would help Grimwald into his armour, 60 pounds of steel that had to be fitted with precise care. A poorly placed strap could mean death in battle, and Grimwald made it clear that any mistake would result in a beating that would leave Aldric bedridden for days. The armour itself was a monument to the knight's brutality. Dents and scratches told stories of violence, while dark stains that couldn't be scrubbed away marked where enemy blood had soaked into the metal. Aldric's job was to maintain this instrument of death, polishing each piece until it gleamed, sharpening the sword until it could split a hair, and ensuring every rivet and joint functioned perfectly. But the physical demands paled compared to the psychological conditioning. Grimwald took pleasure in describing his kills in graphic detail while Aldric worked. He would recount how it felt to drive a sword through a man's chest, how enemy knights screamed when they were unhorsed and trampled by war horses, how the battlefield stank of blood and excrement. These weren't war stories. They were lessons in dehumanization, designed to strip away Aldric's natural revulsion to violence. The training intensified dramatically. Where pages learned basic movements, squires were taught to kill efficiently. Aldric spent hours each day practicing swordwork, not with wooden weapons, but with real steel that could maim or kill with a single mistake. His hands became a network of scars from errant blades and sharp armour edges. His body ached constantly from the weight of increasingly heavy equipment. Horseback training was particularly brutal. Medieval war horses weren't gentle steeds, but massive, aggressive animals trained to bite, kick, and trample enemies. Learning to control them required absolute dominance, and the horses seemed to sense fear like predators scenting blood. Aldric was thrown countless times, suffering broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion that left him confused and nauseous for weeks. The psychological pressure was relentless. Grimwald would suddenly attack Aldric during routine tasks, testing his reflexes and combat readiness. A squire polishing armour might suddenly find a dagger at his throat, with Grimwald snarling about how he'd be dead if this were real combat. Sleep became fitful and paranoid, as Aldric never knew when the next test might come. Perhaps worst of all was the systematic destruction of empathy. Grimwald would force Aldric to watch executions, torture sessions, and the treatment of prisoners. When Aldric showed any sign of compassion or revulsion, he would be beaten and forced to watch again until he could observe human suffering with the same detachment as watching cattle being slaughtered. The food improved slightly, but only because a squire needed more strength than a page. However, the portions were still inadequate for the physical demands placed on growing boys. Aldric learned to steal food when possible, developing the cunning and moral flexibility that would serve a knight well in the field, where resources were scarce and mercy was a luxury. Disease was a constant companion. In an age without antibiotics or proper sanitation, infections from training wounds frequently turned fatal. Aldric watched fellow squires die from what would be minor injuries today. A small cut that became infected, a tooth abscess that spread poison through the body, or simple illnesses that their weakened immune systems couldn't fight off. The castle's blacksmith, Master Willem, taught Aldric to maintain weapons and armour, but these lessons came with their own horrors. The forge was a hellish place where boys regularly suffered severe burns from molten metal or red-hot iron. Willem had lost 3 fingers to the hammer and anvil, and he took pride in showing squires the various ways their carelessness could maim them permanently. Sexual abuse was another unspoken reality. Older knights and men-at-arms preyed upon younger squires with impunity. The concept of consent didn't exist for boys of common birth, and reporting such abuse would result in severe punishment for the victim rather than the perpetrator. Aldric learned to sleep lightly and always be aware of his surroundings, understanding that his body was as much at risk as his life. The economic reality was equally harsh. Despite serving a wealthy knight, Aldric received no wages and owned nothing beyond the clothes on his back. His entire existence depended on Grimwald's whims. If he were injured or crippled, he would simply be discarded with no pension or support. The promise of eventual knighthood was the only thing preventing complete despair, though Aldric was beginning to understand that even achieving that goal might not improve his circumstances significantly. Religious instruction continued, but it had evolved into something even more twisted. The chaplain now taught that God demanded not just obedience, but enthusiastic participation in violence. Killing in the name of one's lord was portrayed as a sacrament, and showing mercy to enemies was presented as a sin against divine will. Prayer became another tool of psychological conditioning, reinforcing the idea that Aldric's sole purpose was to serve as an instrument of authorized violence. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect. Letters from home were rare and often brought news of death or misfortune. Aldric's younger sister had died of fever, his mother had become ill, and his father struggled to maintain their modest holdings. Yet he couldn't return to help or even mourn properly. His duty to his knights superseded all family obligations, and abandoning his post would result in severe punishment for both him and his family. As winter approached in Aldric's second year as a squire, he had already witnessed more violence and cruelty than most modern soldiers see in their entire careers. He had learned to clean blood from armour, to ignore the screams of wounded men, and to follow orders without question regardless of their moral implications. The innocent boy who had left home was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. But the true test of his transformation was yet to come. Soon, he would face his first real battle, where all the brutal training and psychological conditioning would be put to the ultimate test. And in that baptism of blood and terror, Aldric would discover whether he had truly become the weapon his masters intended to create, or whether some fragment of his original humanity might yet survive the crucible of medieval warfare. The path to knighthood was paved with the broken bodies and shattered souls of countless young men, and Aldric was beginning to understand that survival might come at a cost too terrible to calculate. Aldric's first taste of real warfare came in his 16th year, when Duke Mortimer declared war against the neighbouring realm of Thornwick over disputed grain lands. The conflict wasn't born of noble ideals or righteous causes, but from the simple reality that Blackstone Keep's treasury was nearly empty, and war offered the quickest path to replenishment through plunder and ransom. The call to arms came on a bitter morning in late autumn. Sir Grimwald roused Aldric before dawn with a kick to his ribs, bellowing that they would march within the hour. There was no time for preparation or mental readiness. War didn't wait for squires to overcome their fears. Aldric hastily packed his master's gear, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the growing realization that everything he'd endured was merely preparation for this moment. The army that assembled in Blackstone's courtyard bore little resemblance to the gallant hosts described in songs and stories. These were hard men with scarred faces and predatory eyes, many wearing armour that had been stripped from corpses in previous campaigns. The smell of unwashed bodies, leather, and weapon oil created a miasma that would follow them throughout the march. Aldric counted nearly 300 knights, twice as many men-at-arms, and a rabble of camp followers whose presence served purposes he was only beginning to understand. The march to Thornwick took 8 days through increasingly hostile territory. By the 3rd day, they encountered their first burned village, not destroyed by enemy action, but by their own advanced scouts who had taken what they wanted and eliminated potential witnesses. Aldric watched in horror as Grimwald casually examined the charred remains of a peasant cottage, while commenting on the tactical advantages of denying resources to the enemy. The reality of medieval logistics was a brutal education in itself. The army consumed everything in its path like a plague of locusts. Peasants who couldn't flee fast enough were robbed of food, livestock, and anything else of value. Those who resisted were killed without ceremony. Aldric learned that an army didn't carry enough supplies for extended campaigns. It lived by systematically stripping the countryside bare, leaving starvation and death in its wake. Camp life revealed new depths of degradation. Knights who presented themselves as paragons of chivalry in their home castles showed their true nature when freed from social constraints. Women captured during the advance were used and discarded without thought. Prisoners taken for potential ransom were chained like animals and fed scraps that wouldn't be given to dogs. The weak among their own forces, those who fell ill or were injured during the march, were simply abandoned to die. Aldric's duties expanded beyond caring for weapons and armour to include tasks that would have horrified his younger self. He learned to interrogate prisoners using methods that weren't interrogation, but torture disguised with different words. He helped dispose of bodies, both enemy and friendly, with the same casual efficiency used for cleaning cooking pots. Each act of violence or callousness that he participated in stripped away another piece of his original identity. The sexual dynamics within the army were particularly disturbing. Camp followers weren't just women seeking protection, many were slaves taken from conquered territories, forced into lives of sexual servitude. Younger squires like Aldric were also targets for older soldiers who viewed them as legitimate outlets for their urges. The strong preyed upon the weak with impunity, and Aldric learned to sleep with his back against a tree and a knife within reach. Disease spread through the army like wildfire. Without proper sanitation or medical knowledge, dysentery, lice, and various fevers claimed more lives than enemy action would. Aldric watched men waste away from illnesses that would be easily treatable today, their bodies simply unable to cope with the combination of poor food, contaminated water, and constant stress. The dead were buried in mass graves or simply left for carrion birds, depending on how quickly the army needed to move. The first major engagement came at dawn on a fog-shrouded field outside the town of Millbrook. Aldric had imagined battle as a glorious clash of arms between noble warriors. The reality was chaos so complete and terrifying that rational thought became impossible. The noise alone, the screaming of men and horses, the crash of metal on metal, the wet sounds of weapons finding flesh, created a sensory assault that left him nearly paralysed with fear. His role as squire meant staying close to Grimwald while remaining far enough away to avoid hindering his fighting. This gave Aldric a front-row view of violence that no amount of training had prepared him for. He watched knights fall from their horses with gruesome wounds, their expensive armour providing little protection against well-placed strikes. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse where men fought not for glory but for survival, using whatever means necessary to avoid death. The sight of his first kill would haunt Aldric for years afterward. An enemy squire, probably no older than himself, stumbled near Grimwald's position with a spear wound in his side. Grimwald was engaged with an enemy knight, and couldn't finish the boy, so he shouted for Aldric to handle it. Without thinking, operating on pure training and adrenaline, Aldric drove his dagger into the boy's neck. The dying squire's eyes met his for a moment that seemed to last forever, and Aldric saw his own fear and confusion reflected there before the light faded. The aftermath of battle was worse than the fighting itself. The field was carpeted with bodies, many still moving and moaning in their death throes. The wounded who couldn't be ransomed were systematically executed to prevent them from becoming a burden. Aldric helped search corpses for valuables, learning to ignore the personal items, letters from home, religious tokens, keepsakes, that revealed the dead as human beings rather than just obstacles. Looting the town of Millbrook provided Aldric with his first taste of conquest rewards. The systematic rape and pillage that followed wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of war but its primary purpose. Knights competed to see who could extract the most wealth from terrified civilians. Buildings were burned not for tactical reasons but for entertainment. Aldric watched men he'd served faithfully commit acts of cruelty that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The economic reality of medieval warfare became clear as Aldric helped inventory the spoils. Everything of value was catalogued and divided according to strict hierarchies. Common soldiers received copper coins and rough cloth, while knights claimed gold, silver, and fine goods. Aldric, as a squire, received nothing beyond what his master chose to give him, which was usually just enough to prevent starvation. Religious justification for the carnage was provided by army chaplains who blessed the violence and assured the men that God approved of their actions. Aldric listened to sermons that transformed theft into righteousness and murder into divine service. The same priests who preached mercy and forgiveness in peacetime now proclaimed that showing no quarter to enemies was the path to salvation. As the army prepared to return to Blackstone Keep with their plunder, Aldric had been fundamentally changed by his first campaign. The boy who had marched out weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone who could watch atrocities without flinching and participate in violence without conscious thought. He had learned that war wasn't a glorious adventure, but a systematic exercise in organised brutality designed to transfer wealth from the weak to the strong. The journey home provided time for reflection that Aldric found increasingly disturbing. He began to understand that the horrific experiences of his first campaign weren't aberrations, but standard operating procedures. Every future campaign would bring similar horrors, and each one would require him to surrender more of his humanity in service to masters who viewed him as little more than a useful tool. The path to knighthood was revealing itself as a journey into moral darkness from which there might be no return. The winter following Aldric's first campaign brought no respite from the harsh realities of his existence. Returning to Blackstone Keep, he discovered that survival in war was merely the first qualification for continued service. The castle's political landscape had shifted during their Lord Duncan Ashford, a visiting noble from the eastern provinces, had arrived at Blackstone Keep with disturbing news. The king was demanding increased military service from all his vassals, and Duke Mortimer was being pressed to provide more knights for an upcoming campaign against Scottish raiders. This meant that promising squires would need to be elevated to full knighthood faster than tradition dictated, regardless of their readiness or the devastating toll such acceleration would take on their development. Aldric found himself selected for this expedited process, not as a reward for his service, but because the brutal campaign had proven he could kill without hesitation and follow orders without question. The ceremony that would transform him from squire to knight was scheduled for the spring equinox, giving him only months to prepare for responsibilities that typically required years of additional training. The preparation for knighthood involved ordeals that pushed even hardened squires to their breaking points. Master-at-Arms Roderick the Blackheart, a knight whose cruelty exceeded even Sir Grimwald's, took personal charge of Aldric's final education. Under Roderick's tutelage, Aldric learned advanced combat techniques that focused not on honour or fair fighting, but on killing enemies as efficiently as possible, using whatever means necessary. The training included lessons in psychological warfare that would have been considered torture in any civilized context. Aldric was taught to use fear as a weapon, learning how to intimidate enemies through deliberate displays of cruelty. He practiced interrogation techniques on captured bandits, methods that involved systematic infliction of pain designed to break a person's will without immediately causing death. These weren't theoretical exercises. The screams echoing from the castle's lower levels were testimony to their practical application. Economic instruction formed another crucial component of his education, though it bore no resemblance to legitimate commerce. Aldric learned how to assess the value of plundered goods, how to extract maximum ransoms from captured enemies, and how to establish protection rackets among merchant caravans travelling through his future territory. Knights weren't just warriors. They were organised criminals operating under the legal protection of feudal law. The religious aspects of his preparation were equally disturbing. Brother Mordecai, the castle chaplain, conducted private sessions with soon-to-be knights that involved rituals designed to suppress any remaining moral qualms about violence. These ceremonies combined genuine religious elements with practices that bordered on blasphemy, creating a twisted theology that transformed murder into sacrament and cruelty into divine service. Aldric's understanding of women's role in medieval society underwent a particularly harsh education during this period. He learned that noble ladies were primarily valued as breeding stock and political assets, while common women existed solely for the pleasure and convenience of their male superiors. The concept of consent was not merely ignored, it was actively scorned as weakness that interfered with a knight's natural rights and privileges. The legal system, such as it existed, was revealed as another tool of oppression rather than justice. Aldric studied the complex web of feudal obligations that bound society together, learning how these laws could be manipulated to justify almost any action taken by those with sufficient power. A knight could kill, steal, or rape with virtual impunity as long as his actions served his lord's interests or could be rationalised as necessary for maintaining order. Training in siege warfare introduced Aldric to military tactics that deliberately targeted civilian populations. He learned how to conduct systematic starvation campaigns, how to contaminate water supplies, and how to use captured civilians as human shields or bargaining tools. These weren't desperate measures employed in extreme circumstances. They were standard operational procedures designed to break enemy morale through calculated cruelty. The castle's armoury became Aldric's second home as he learned to maintain and operate the increasingly sophisticated weapons of war. Crossbows, siege engines, and early gunpowder weapons all required specialised knowledge that went far beyond simple sword fighting. More importantly, he learned how these weapons could be used to terrorise populations into submission, understanding that fear was often more effective than actual violence in maintaining control. Medical training proved to be another exercise in brutality disguised as education. While Aldric did learn basic battlefield surgery and wound treatment, he also learned how to inflict precise injuries that would cause maximum pain without immediate death. This knowledge was supposedly for interrogation purposes, but it served the dual function of making knights more effective at psychological warfare. The social dynamics within the castle continued to evolve as Aldric's status increased. He was no longer merely a target for abuse, but was expected to participate in maintaining the hierarchy through violence against those below him. New pages and squires became his victims, as he was required to demonstrate his authority through the same methods that had been used against him years earlier. His relationship with Sir Grimwald changed as well, becoming more of a partnership between predators than a master-student dynamic. Grimwald began involving Aldric in private ventures that went beyond their official duties, raiding expeditions against isolated settlements, extortion schemes targeting local merchants, and slave trading operations that supplied both the castle's labour needs and provided additional income. The financial realities of knighthood became increasingly clear as Aldric learned about the costs associated with his new status. Knights were expected to maintain expensive equipment, support a household staff, and contribute to their lord's military campaigns. These expenses far exceeded any legitimate income from land grants or official duties, making participation in various illegal enterprises not just attractive but necessary for survival. Training in heraldry and genealogy revealed another layer of the knight's role in medieval society. Aldric learned how to fabricate family histories and forge documents that could legitimize land claims or political positions. The entire system of noble bloodlines was revealed as an elaborate fiction maintained through systematic deception and enforced through violence against anyone who questioned its validity. As spring approached and his knighthood ceremony drew near, Aldric reflected on the transformation he'd undergone. The innocent boy who had left his family's manor was completely gone, replaced by a calculating predator who could commit any atrocity without conscience. He had learned that knighthood wasn't about honour or service, It was about becoming an efficient instrument of oppression in service to masters who viewed human life as a commodity to be exploited. The ceremony that would officially make him a knight was approaching rapidly, and with it would come new responsibilities and opportunities for cruelty that would test the limits of what remained of his humanity. The path he had travelled had been paved with the suffering of countless victims, and the road ahead promised only more violence and moral degradation. Yet there was no choice but to continue forward, for in medieval society refusing to become a monster simply meant becoming a victim instead. The spring equinox of 1251 arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself was mocking the solemnity of what was about to transpire. Aldric's knighting ceremony was scheduled for dawn, following a night of vigil that would supposedly purify his soul for the sacred duty ahead. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of systematic brutalization and moral corruption, he was expected to spend one night in prayer to cleanse himself of sins that his future role would require him to commit daily. The vigil began at sunset in the castle's chapel, a cold stone chamber decorated with tapestries depicting various saints being tortured and martyred. Aldric knelt before the altar wearing simple white robes, his sword and armour laid out before him like sacrificial offerings. Brother Mordecai had explained that this was meant to represent his rebirth as a holy warrior, though the priest's scarred hands and cruel smile suggested that holiness had little to do with the transformation about to take place. Throughout the long night, other knights came to offer counsel and warnings about his new responsibilities. Sir Grimwald spoke of the practical necessities of maintaining authority through fear, describing in detail how public executions and torture sessions could be used to keep peasant populations compliant. Sir Roderick shared techniques for extracting information from prisoners, methods that relied more on psychology than physical pain, but were no less effective at breaking a person's will. Lord Ashford, the visiting noble, provided what he termed political education during the midnight hours. He explained how the feudal system was designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of those willing to use violence to maintain their positions. Knights, he emphasized, were the enforcement arm of this system, responsible for ensuring that the natural order of society remained undisturbed by inconvenient concepts like justice or mercy. As dawn approached, Duke Mortimer himself appeared in the chapel to conduct the final phase of the ceremony. The Duke was an imposing figure whose presence seemed to drain warmth from the very air around him. His face bore the marks of countless battles, but his eyes held a coldness that spoke of psychological wounds far deeper than any sword could inflict. He had been moulded by the same system that was now claiming Aldric, and the result was something that barely qualified as human. The dubbing ceremony itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as religious sacrament. Duke Mortimer's sword touched Aldric's shoulders as he recited oaths that bound him not to God or justice, but to absolute obedience to his feudal superiors. Each vow stripped away another layer of personal autonomy, until Aldric stood as little more than a weapon, awaiting orders from those who wielded him. The crowd that gathered to witness the ceremony was composed entirely of other knights and nobles, their faces reflecting the same moral emptiness that Aldric could feel growing within himself. There were no common people present to witness this transformation. Their role was to suffer the consequences of what was being created, not to celebrate its birth. The absence of innocent witnesses was itself a telling commentary on the true nature of what knighthood represented. Following the religious ceremony, Aldric was led to the castle's armoury, where his new equipment awaited. The armour that was fitted to his body had been stripped from a knight killed in the previous year's campaign, its original owner forgotten as completely as if he had never existed. The sword placed in Aldric's hands bore notches and stains that told their own stories of violence, each mark representing a life ended or a body maimed in service to the feudal system. The heraldic symbols painted on his shield were not his family's ancestral arms, but entirely fabricated designs created to support a false genealogy that would legitimize his new status. Aldric learned that most knights' family histories were similarly fictional, elaborate lies maintained through intimidation and the systematic destruction of contradictory evidence. Truth was another casualty of the system that had created him. His first official duty as a knight was to participate in the taxation of local villages, a process that bore more resemblance to organised theft than legitimate revenue collection. Accompanied by a squad of men-at-arms, Aldric rode through the countryside surrounding Blackstone Keep, demanding payment from peasants who could barely afford to feed their own families. Those who couldn't pay faced brutal punishment designed to serve as an example to others. The economic reality of his new position became immediately apparent. As a knight, Aldric was expected to maintain a lifestyle that far exceeded his legitimate income from land grants. The gap between his expenses and his official revenue had to be filled through what the nobility euphemistically called private enterprise, activities that would be recognised as banditry if practised by anyone without a noble title. Within his first week as a knight, Aldric participated in 3 separate raids against merchant caravans travelling through what was supposedly protected territory. The systematic robbery of these traders was conducted under the legal fiction of collecting tolls for road maintenance, though no maintenance was ever performed, and the seized goods never found their way to any legitimate treasury. The treatment of prisoners taken during these raids provided Aldric with his first opportunity to practice the interrogation techniques he had learned during his preparation for knighthood. The screams that echoed from Blackstone Keep's dungeons during these sessions served multiple purposes, extracting information about other potential targets while simultaneously terrorising the local population into compliance with increasingly outrageous demands. Sexual violence became another routine aspect of his new role, as knights were expected to exercise what were termed traditional privileges over women in their territory. The legal system provided no protection for victims of noble abuse, and resistance was met with retaliation that often extended to entire families. Aldric learned to view women as property to be used and discarded according to his whims and needs. The religious justification for these activities continued through regular sermons that redefined sin and virtue to accommodate the necessities of feudal rule. Brother Mordecai preached that God had established the social hierarchy for divine purposes, and that any attempt to resist or question this order was tantamount to blasphemy. Charity was redefined as weakness, mercy as foolishness, and cruelty as divine justice. Training continued even after achieving knighthood, focusing now on advanced techniques for population control and resource extraction. Aldric learned how to organise protection rackets that forced local merchants to pay for security against threats that the knights themselves created. He studied methods for conducting false flag operations that could justify military action against rival territories while maintaining plausible deniability. The social isolation that came with his new status was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of his transformation. Knights existed in a world apart from common humanity, surrounded only by others who had undergone the same process of systematic moral destruction. Normal human relationships became impossible when every interaction was filtered through considerations of power, dominance, and potential profit. As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of new military campaigns and fresh opportunities for violence, Aldric reflected on what he had become. The transformation was complete. He was now Sir Aldric of Ravenshollow, a knight of the realm and a fully functional instrument of feudal oppression. The boy who had wept for his mother was as dead as if he had been buried in the castle's graveyard, replaced by something that could inflict suffering without conscience and follow orders without question. The truly horrifying realization was that this transformation wasn't unique to him. It was the deliberate product of a system designed to create human monsters and unleash them upon the world in service to those who benefited from chaos and suffering. The autumn of Aldric's first year as a knight brought news that would test every lesson he had learned about the true nature of medieval warfare. King Henry III had declared a holy crusade against heretical sects in the southern provinces, and all knights were commanded to take up arms in God's name. What distinguished this campaign from previous secular conflicts was the religious fervour that masked an even more systematic approach to brutality and exploitation. The papal legate who arrived at Blackstone Keep to bless this holy war was Cardinal Malthus, a man whose corpulent frame and jewelled rings spoke more eloquently than his sermons about the true relationship between the church and violence. He preached to the assembled knights about their divine duty to cleanse the land of heretics, but his private meetings with Duke Mortimer focused on the division of spoils and the theological loopholes that would justify any atrocity committed in God's name. Preparation for the crusade revealed new depths of cynicism within the feudal system. The heretics they were supposedly fighting weren't dangerous revolutionaries or foreign invaders, but simply communities that had grown too prosperous for their own good. Their theological crimes consisted mainly of questioning why they should pay taxes to distant nobles and tithes to corrupt priests who lived in luxury while common people starved. The army that assembled for this holy war was larger and more professionally brutal than any force Aldric had previously witnessed. Knights from across the kingdom converged on Blackstone Keep, bringing with them men-at-arms who'd been specifically recruited for their willingness to commit atrocities against civilian populations. These weren't soldiers in any traditional sense, but professional terrorists whose expertise lay in breaking the will of entire communities through calculated cruelty. The march south took on the character of a religious pilgrimage, complete with banners bearing sacred symbols and priests chanting hymns as they walked. This facade of holiness made the systematic destruction they left in their wake even more psychologically devastating for their victims. Villages that offered food and shelter to what appeared to be a religious procession found themselves stripped of everything valuable before being burned to the ground. Aldric's role in these early atrocities was to document the wealth seized from each settlement, ostensibly to ensure proper distribution according to divine will. In reality, he was learning advanced techniques for inventory management that would be essential for the large-scale looting operations planned for the heretical territories. Every gold coin, every piece of silver, every valuable textile had to be catalogued and assessed for its contribution to the holy cause. The siege of Millhaven, the first major heretical stronghold they encountered, provided Aldric with his introduction to religious warfare's unique horrors. Unlike secular conflicts where prisoners might be ransomed or enemy soldiers shown quarter, holy war demanded the complete eradication of theological error through methods that would have shocked even hardened mercenaries. The civilians trapped within Millhaven's walls weren't just military obstacles to be overcome, but souls requiring salvation through suffering. Cardinal Malthus explained that heretics could only achieve redemption through experiencing the full consequences of their theological errors, which conveniently meant that any torture or abuse inflicted upon them was actually an act of Christian charity. The siege lasted 3 months, during which time Aldric learned techniques for psychological warfare that specifically exploited religious beliefs. Captured heretics were forced to watch as their religious texts were burned and their priests tortured to death. Children were baptized in the correct faith immediately before being killed, ensuring their souls would reach heaven while demonstrating the consequences of their parents' theological stubbornness. When Millhaven's walls were finally breached, the sack that followed was conducted with a methodical thoroughness that impressed even veteran knights. Every building was searched not just for valuables, but for evidence of heretical practice. Books were burned, religious artifacts destroyed, and anyone suspected of leadership in the heretical community subjected to public execution methods designed to serve as both punishment and entertainment. The economic aspects of religious warfare proved even more lucrative than secular conflicts. Heretics' property could be confiscated without any legal complications, since theological error automatically invalidated all claims to worldly possessions. Entire family fortunes accumulated over generations could be seized and redistributed among the faithful without any pretense of compensation or justice. Aldric's education in religious law revealed how theology could be weaponized to justify virtually any action taken by those in power. Concepts like divine will and religious necessity provided blanket authorization for activities that would be recognized as criminal in any secular context. The Church's blessing transformed theft into righteous confiscation and murder into holy execution. The treatment of women during religious campaigns followed patterns that were even more systematically dehumanizing than those employed in secular warfare. Female heretics were considered especially dangerous because of their supposed susceptibility to demonic influence, which meant they required more intensive correction through methods that combined sexual violence with theological instruction. Children presented particular challenges in religious warfare, as their souls were theoretically salvageable despite their parents' errors. The solution developed by the Church was a systematic program of separation and re-education that involved removing children from heretical families and placing them in institutions where their memories could be systematically erased and replaced with correct theological understanding. The psychological toll of participating in these religious atrocities was managed through elaborate theological frameworks that redefined normal moral categories. Compassion became weakness that interfered with God's justice, while cruelty was transformed into divine love that served the eternal interests of its victims. Priests provided individual counselling to knights who showed signs of moral doubt, helping them understand how their natural human reactions were actually temptations from Satan. As winter approached, and the crusading army prepared to move against larger heretical settlements, Aldric had mastered the theological language that made systematic brutality not just acceptable, but spiritually necessary. He could recite scriptural justifications for torture, theological arguments for genocide, and religious rationales for the complete destruction of communities that had committed no crime beyond interpreting Christianity differently than their rulers preferred. The transformation was complete. He had become not just a knight, but a holy warrior capable of committing any atrocity as long as it could be framed in religious terms. The boy who had once prayed for his mother's safety was now preparing to destroy other mothers in service to a God whose love apparently required the systematic elimination of anyone who questioned the Church's earthly authority. The crusade was revealing itself as the ultimate expression of medieval knighthood's true purpose, the transformation of religious faith into a weapon of oppression that could justify any level of violence against those who threatened the established order, and Aldric had become a master of wielding that weapon with devastating efficiency. The spring of 1253 brought an end to the crusade against the heretics, but for Aldric, the return to Blackstone Keep marked the beginning of a new and perhaps more insidious phase of his service. The systematic brutalities of holy war had proven so profitable that Duke Mortimer decided to establish what he euphemistically termed administrative reforms throughout his territory, essentially institutionalizing the techniques of oppression that had proven so effective against religious dissidents. Aldric found himself appointed as Reeve of the Northern Marches, a position that placed him in direct control over a dozen villages and their surrounding farmlands. This wasn't a reward for faithful service, but a practical recognition that he had demonstrated the psychological flexibility necessary to extract maximum revenue from civilian populations while maintaining the legal fiction that his actions served legitimate governmental purposes. The manor house assigned to him had belonged to a family of minor nobles who had been convicted of harbouring heretical sympathies during the recent campaign. Their fate, public execution followed by confiscation of all property, served as a clear example to other landowners about the consequences of questioning established authority. Aldric moved into their former home still furnished with their personal belongings, eating from their plates and sleeping in their beds while their orphaned children begged in the village streets. His first official act as Reeve was to conduct a comprehensive census of his territory, though this wasn't motivated by administrative efficiency, but by the need to identify every source of potential revenue. Each family was assessed not just for their current assets, but for their productive capacity, their hidden wealth, and their vulnerability to various forms of legal extortion. The resulting documents read less like government records than business plans for systematic exploitation. The taxation system Aldric implemented went far beyond traditional feudal obligations, incorporating lessons learned during the Crusade about how religious and legal justifications could be used to legitimize virtually unlimited extraction. Families were required to pay fees for protection against bandits who were actually Aldric's own men, operating under false colours, fines for violations of constantly changing regulations they couldn't possibly follow, and special assessments for religious festivals that served no purpose beyond enriching the local nobility. The judicial system under Aldric's control became a sophisticated mechanism for converting justice into profit. Minor infractions that had traditionally been resolved through community mediation were elevated to criminal offences requiring substantial fines. More serious crimes were punished through forced labour assignments that provided free workers for Aldric's various construction projects, while simultaneously removing potential troublemakers from their communities. The marriage laws proved particularly lucrative, as Aldric claimed the traditional right to approve all unions within his territory, while charging substantial fees for his consent. Young women whose families couldn't afford these payments found themselves subject to alternative arrangements that served Aldric's personal interests as well as his financial ones. The systematic abuse of this authority was conducted with legal precision that made resistance virtually impossible. Trade regulations allowed Aldric to control every aspect of economic activity within his domain, from the prices charged by local merchants to the routes used by travelling traders. He established monopolies on essential goods like salt and iron, forcing his subjects to purchase these necessities at inflated prices from vendors who shared their profits with him. Competition was eliminated through legal mechanisms that made unauthorized commerce a form of theft from the feudal lord. The religious policies Aldric implemented were designed to use spiritual authority as another tool of social control. He appointed priests who preached sermons emphasizing obedience to secular authority as a religious duty, while establishing religious festivals that required expensive contributions from families already struggling to meet their basic obligations. Failure to participate enthusiastically in these spiritual exercises was treated as evidence of heretical tendencies that could justify even more severe measures. Military service requirements were manipulated to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Young men were conscripted for extended periods that prevented them from establishing independent livelihoods, while providing Aldric with a constant supply of free labour for his various projects. Their absence from their families created additional economic hardship that made the remaining villagers even more dependent on their lord's questionable generosity. The documentation systems Aldric established were masterpieces of bureaucratic oppression that transformed every aspect of daily life into potential sources of revenue. Birth certificates, death certificates, travel permits, and trade licenses all required fees that might seem modest individually, but collectively consumed a substantial portion of his subjects' income. The paperwork itself became a form of control, as illiterate peasants found themselves dependent on literate officials who could manipulate documents to their own advantage. Education policies were designed to maintain the knowledge disparities that made exploitation possible. Aldric strictly controlled access to literacy training, ensuring that only individuals who served his interest could acquire the skills necessary to understand the legal and financial mechanisms being used against their communities. Religious education, by contrast, was mandatory and focused exclusively on themes of obedience and acceptance of divine hierarchy. The healthcare system under Aldric's administration reflected the same cynical approach to human welfare that characterized all his policies. Medical treatment was available only to those who could afford substantial payments, while traditional healers were prosecuted as witches if they provided effective care that competed with official physicians. Epidemic diseases were allowed to spread through poor communities while the wealthy remained protected, creating demographic changes that served Aldric's long-term economic interests. Housing regulations gave Aldric the authority to condemn existing structures and force families to purchase building permits for replacements that had to meet specifications requiring expensive materials available only through his authorized suppliers. Homeless families created by this process could be arrested for vagrancy and assigned to forced labor programs that generated additional revenue while removing potential sources of social unrest. The entertainment and cultural policies Aldric established were designed to channel popular frustrations into harmless outlets while generating additional income. Traditional festivals were replaced with expensive celebrations that honoured feudal authority, while travelling entertainers were required to obtain expensive licenses and submit their performances for approval by censors who ensured that no subversive messages reached public audiences. As his third year as Reeve drew to a close, Aldric had successfully transformed his territory into a model of efficient extraction that impressed even Duke Mortimer with its profitability. The villages under his control had been systematically stripped of their independence and prosperity, their inhabitants reduced to a state of dependency that made rebellion not just difficult, but literally inconceivable. The human cost of this administrative efficiency was measured in broken families, abandoned children, and a pervasive despair that had settled over the countryside like a permanent fog. But from Aldric's perspective, these were merely the inevitable costs of effective governance, prices that had to be paid to maintain the stability and prosperity of those who truly mattered in the feudal hierarchy. He had become not just a knight, but an architect of systematic oppression whose innovations in the techniques of exploitation would influence the development of feudal administration for generations to come. The year 1256 brought an unexpected challenge to Aldric's carefully orchestrated system of oppression when reports reached Duke Mortimer of a peasant uprising in the Eastern Territories. Unlike the heretical movements that had provided convenient pretexts for religious warfare, this rebellion was purely secular in nature. Desperate people, pushed beyond their capacity to endure systematic exploitation, had finally reached their breaking point and taken up arms against their feudal masters. The rebellion had begun in the village of Oakenford, where a particularly brutal Reeve had attempted to claim the traditional right of prima nocta, with a merchant's daughter whose family had already paid substantial fees to avoid such attention. When the girl's father protested, he was publicly flogged and his shop confiscated for seditious behaviour. The incident sparked outrage that quickly spread to neighbouring communities, where similar abuses had created a reservoir of barely contained fury. What made this uprising particularly dangerous was its organised nature. Unlike spontaneous riots that could be suppressed through overwhelming force, the rebels had established a sophisticated network of communication and supply that allowed them to coordinate attacks across multiple territories simultaneously. They had also demonstrated tactical intelligence by targeting the economic infrastructure that supported feudal authority rather than simply engaging in random acts of violence. Duke Mortimer's response was to dispatch his most effective administrators to suppress the rebellion using whatever methods proved necessary. Aldric found himself appointed as military coordinator for the suppression campaign, a role that would require him to apply everything he had learned about population control and psychological warfare to the challenge of breaking an organised resistance movement. The army assembled for this campaign was different from the forces used in traditional warfare. Rather than knights trained for battlefield combat, Aldric commanded specialists in what would later be called counter-insurgency operations, men skilled in infiltration, interrogation, and the systematic application of terror to civilian populations. Their equipment reflected this specialised role, emphasising tools for capturing and controlling people rather than weapons designed for killing enemies quickly. The strategic approach Aldric developed was based on the principle that rebellion could only be sustained by the active or passive support of the general population. His campaign therefore focused not primarily on defeating rebel fighters, but on making it impossible for ordinary people to provide the rebels with food, shelter, information, or recruits. This required techniques that deliberately blurred the line between combatants and civilians. The first phase of the campaign involved establishing a network of informants within the rebellious territories. Aldric used a combination of bribes, threats, and blackmail to recruit local people who would report on rebel activities in exchange for protection and modest rewards. These informants weren't volunteers, but people who had been systematically compromised through carefully documented evidence of minor infractions that could be prosecuted if they refused to cooperate. The intelligence gathered through this network allowed Aldric to identify not just active rebels, but also the family members, friends, and business associates who provided them with support. Rather than arresting these individuals immediately, he used surveillance techniques to map the entire social structure that sustained the rebellion, creating detailed charts that showed how information and resources flowed through the insurgent communities. The psychological warfare component of the campaign was designed to create an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that would make coordination between rebel groups increasingly difficult. Aldric spread false information about rebel plans and leadership through his network of informants, causing confusion and internal conflicts within the resistance movement. He also arranged for apparent betrayals that would make rebel leaders suspicious of their own supporters. The economic warfare tactics employed were perhaps the most devastating aspect of the campaign. Aldric implemented what he termed resource denial operations that systematically destroyed or confiscated anything that could potentially support rebel activities. This included not just weapons and military supplies, but also food, tools, livestock, and even cooking utensils that could be used to prepare meals for insurgent fighters. The legal framework for these operations was provided by emergency decrees that suspended normal judicial procedures in areas affected by rebellion. These laws made it possible to arrest anyone on suspicion of supporting insurgent activities while seizing their property as evidence of treason. The burden of proof was reversed, requiring accused individuals to demonstrate their innocence rather than forcing authorities to prove guilt. The detention facilities established for captured rebels and suspected sympathizers were designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They functioned as prisons for holding dangerous individuals, interrogation centers for extracting information about rebel operations, and public demonstrations of the consequences of resistance. The conditions in these facilities were deliberately harsh enough to break the will of most prisoners, while serving as warnings to potential supporters. The interrogation techniques Aldric employed were based on methods developed during the religious crusades, but refined for use against secular rebels who couldn't be motivated by theological arguments. Physical torture was used sparingly and strategically, primarily to establish credibility for psychological methods that were ultimately more effective at extracting reliable information from resistant subjects. The propaganda campaign accompanying the military operations was designed to undermine popular support for the rebellion by portraying the insurgents as bandits and criminals rather than legitimate protesters against unjust conditions. Stories about rebel atrocities were circulated widely, though most of these accounts were fabricated or greatly exaggerated to create the impression that the resistance movement posed a threat to ordinary people's safety. The turning point in the campaign came when Aldric successfully infiltrated the rebel leadership through a carefully orchestrated false flag operation. He arranged for one of his agents to appear to defect from the feudal forces, while carrying information that seemed valuable enough to gain the trust of rebel commanders. This infiltrator was then able to provide intelligence that allowed Aldric to eliminate the rebellion's most effective leaders in a series of coordinated raids. The collapse of organised resistance was followed by what Aldric termed pacification operations, designed to ensure that rebellious sentiments wouldn't resurface in the future. These involved relocating entire families away from their traditional communities, breaking up social networks that had supported the insurgency, and establishing permanent surveillance systems that would detect any future attempts at organised resistance. The success of Aldric's counterinsurgency campaign established him as Duke Mortimer's most trusted specialist in what was euphemistically called internal security. His methods were studied and copied by other feudal administrators facing similar challenges, contributing to the development of increasingly sophisticated techniques for maintaining social control through systematic oppression. As the campaign concluded and normal administrative functions resumed in the formerly rebellious territories, Aldric reflected on how the experience had further refined his understanding of power and its application. He had learned that the greatest threat to feudal authority came not from external enemies, but from the internal contradictions of a system that could only maintain itself through increasingly brutal exploitation of the very people whose labour made it possible. The techniques he had developed for suppressing rebellion would prove invaluable in his future career, but they also represented another step in his transformation, from a human being into something that existed purely to serve the interests of a system that had long since abandoned any pretense of serving justice or promoting human welfare. The autumn of 1259 marked a turning point in Aldric's career, when Duke Mortimer summoned him to participate in what would prove to be the most psychologically devastating assignment of his service. A diplomatic marriage had been arranged between the Duke's youngest daughter, Lady Rosalind, and a powerful baron from the neighbouring kingdom of Grimthorne. However, intelligence reports suggested that this alliance was actually a carefully orchestrated trap designed to eliminate Duke Mortimer and absorb his territories into Grimthorne's expanding domain. The wedding celebration was to take place at Thornwick Castle, a supposedly neutral location that had been chosen for its symbolic significance as a place where previous peace treaties had been signed. In reality, the castle's remote location and complex layout made it an ideal setting for what Aldric's reconnaissance revealed was essentially a planned massacre disguised as a festive occasion. Duke Mortimer's response to this threat demonstrated the cold pragmatism that had kept him in power for over 2 decades. Rather than cancel the wedding or confront his enemies directly, he decided to turn their own trap against them using methods that would eliminate the Grimthorne threat while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement in what would appear to be a tragic accident. Aldric was selected to coordinate this operation because his reputation for creative problem-solving had impressed even the Duke's most experienced advisors. The challenge was to neutralize a large number of well-armed enemies in a confined space while ensuring that none of the survivors would be able to provide credible testimony about what had actually occurred during the chaos. The preparation for this mission required Aldric to master skills that went far beyond traditional military tactics. He studied the architectural plans of Thornwick Castle with the obsessive attention to detail of an engineer, identifying structural weaknesses that could be exploited and escape routes that would need to be blocked. He also learned advanced techniques in chemistry and metallurgy that would allow him to create weapons and tools specifically designed for this unique environment. The social engineering aspects of the operation were equally complex. Aldric had to develop a detailed understanding of the guest list, seating arrangements, and ceremonial protocols that would govern the wedding festivities. Every element of the celebration had to be analysed for its potential contribution to the planned operation, from the timing of toasts to the placement of decorative elements that could be weaponized when necessary. The psychological preparation required for this mission was perhaps the most challenging aspect. Unlike previous campaigns where Aldric had fought against enemies who could be dehumanized as heretics or rebels, this operation would require him to smile and socialize with his intended victims for days before killing them. He had to learn to suppress every natural human response to social interaction, while maintaining a facade of genuine friendship and celebration. The advance team that Aldric led into Thornwick Castle arrived several days before the main wedding party, ostensibly to assist with preparations and security arrangements. In reality, they were specialists in sabotage and assassination who used their access to the castle to plant carefully concealed weapons, prepare escape routes, and establish the complex sequence of events that would transform a wedding feast into a carefully orchestrated slaughter. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of theatrical deception that would have impressed the most cynical court observers. Lady Rosalind, who had been informed of the true nature of her marriage alliance, played her role as blushing bride with convincing enthusiasm, while secretly coordinating with Aldric's team to ensure that the key Valethorn leaders would be positioned optimally for the evening's real entertainment. The feast that followed the ceremony was conducted with all the elaborate protocol appropriate to such an important diplomatic occasion. Multiple courses were served with great ceremony, toasts were offered, celebrating the new alliance between the two kingdoms, and entertainment was provided by musicians and performers who had been carefully selected for their ability to mask the subtle preparations being made throughout the hall. The signal for the operation to begin was given during what appeared to be a spontaneous toast offered by Duke Mortimer to honour his new son-in-law. As the assembled guests raised their cups in celebration, Aldric's team moved with practiced precision to seal the exits and neutralise the Valethorn guards who had been strategically dispersed throughout the castle. The coordination required for this simultaneous action demonstrated the level of training and discipline that Aldric had achieved in his years of service. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense, but a carefully choreographed execution designed to appear as though it had resulted from a sudden outbreak of violence between rival factions. The Valethorn delegation found themselves trapped in a hall where every exit was blocked and every potential weapon had been removed or sabotaged. Their attempts to organise resistance were frustrated by the systematic elimination of their leaders and the creation of tactical confusion through the use of smoke and deliberately induced panic. The aftermath of the massacre was managed with the same attention to detail that had characterised its planning. The few survivors who remained alive were carefully selected for their political usefulness and their psychological vulnerability to manipulation. Their testimony about the evening's events was shaped through a combination of trauma, suggestion, and carefully planted evidence that supported the official narrative of a tragic accident caused by political tensions between minor nobility. The clean-up operation required several days of intensive work to remove all evidence of premeditation while creating a crime scene that would support the story of spontaneous violence. Bodies were repositioned, weapons were planted or removed as appropriate, and physical evidence was carefully manipulated to create a coherent narrative that would satisfy investigators who weren't looking too closely at uncomfortable details. The political consequences of the Thornwick massacre were exactly what Duke Mortimer had intended. The Valethorn kingdom found itself leaderless and vulnerable to internal power struggles, while Duke Mortimer was able to position himself as a grieving father-in-law seeking justice for the tragic loss of his daughter's wedding party. Within a year, he had absorbed most of Valethorn's territory through a combination of military pressure and strategic marriages with surviving nobles who preferred accommodation to destruction. For Aldric, the successful completion of this operation represented the culmination of his transformation from a simple knight into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. He had demonstrated the ability to plan and execute complex operations that combined military, political, and psychological elements in service of strategic objectives that transcended simple conquest or plunder. The skills he had developed during the Thornwick operation would prove invaluable in his future assignments, but they also marked his complete abandonment of any connection to normal human morality. He had become a specialist in the application of violence for political purposes, a master of deception whose expertise lay in making atrocities appear to be accidents or the inevitable consequences of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The boy who had once wept for his mother was not merely dead, but had been systematically transformed into something that could orchestrate the deaths of dozens of innocent people while maintaining the social facade necessary to convince observers that he remained an honourable knight serving legitimate authority. The winter of 1262 brought unexpected news that would challenge even Aldric's hardened psyche in ways he had never anticipated. A papal legate arrived at Blackstone Keep with orders that Duke Mortimer was to lead a crusade to the Holy Land, where Saracen forces had recaptured several key Christian strongholds. Unlike the domestic campaigns against heretics and rebels, this would be a true foreign war against enemies who possessed military capabilities equal to or exceeding those of the Christian forces. What made this assignment particularly complex was the political reality behind the religious rhetoric. The Pope's call for crusade was primarily motivated by his need to remove potentially troublesome nobles from European politics while redirecting their violent energies toward external enemies. The spiritual rewards promised to crusading knights were genuine according to church doctrine, but the practical challenges of mounting an effective military campaign in hostile foreign territory were overwhelming. Aldric found himself appointed as Duke Mortimer's chief intelligence coordinator for the crusade, a role that required him to master entirely new forms of warfare adapted to desert conditions and foreign cultures. The enemies they would face weren't European peasants or disorganized rebels, but professional soldiers who had been fighting Christian invaders for generations and had developed sophisticated countermeasures against Western military tactics. The preparations for the crusade revealed the staggering logistical challenges involved in transporting and maintaining a large military force thousands of miles from its home base. Everything from weapons and armour to food and medical supplies had to be carefully calculated and ranged, while the human element, keeping soldiers motivated and disciplined during months of dangerous travel, presented psychological challenges that required entirely new approaches to military leadership. The journey to the Holy Land began with a sea voyage that exposed Aldric to forms of suffering he had never previously encountered. The ships were overcrowded, poorly ventilated vessels where disease spread rapidly through the cramped quarters. Many knights who had survived years of European warfare succumbed to seasickness, dysentery and fevers before they ever reached enemy territory. The romantic notion of crusading knights sailing boldly toward glory was replaced by the reality of men dying miserably in their own filth below deck. The climate of the Holy Land presented challenges that no amount of European experience could have prepared them for. The desert heat was literally killing, capable of felling armoured knights within hours of exposure. The constant shortage of clean water created a desperate scramble for survival that took precedence over military objectives. Many crusaders died not from enemy action but from dehydration, heat stroke, and diseases caused by consuming contaminated water from whatever sources they could find. The cultural barriers between the Christian invaders and the local population proved to be as formidable as any military obstacle. Aldric discovered that his skills in intimidation and psychological warfare, so effective against European peasants, were virtually useless against people whose entire worldview was fundamentally different from anything he had previously encountered. The linguistic challenges alone made intelligence gathering exponentially more difficult than it had been in familiar territories. The military tactics employed by Saracen forces demonstrated a level of sophistication that shocked European commanders who had assumed their technological and organizational superiority would guarantee victory. The enemy's use of mobility, knowledge of local terrain, and understanding of desert warfare created strategic challenges that traditional European heavy cavalry tactics were poorly equipped to address. Many engagements resulted in devastating defeats for Christian forces who found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies they had underestimated. The siege of Ashkelon became Aldric's introduction to warfare conducted on equal terms against competent enemies. Unlike the systematic brutalization of helpless populations that had characterized his previous campaigns, this was a contest between professional military forces where victory required genuine tactical innovation rather than simple applications of overwhelming violence. The psychological impact of facing enemies who were not only willing but able to fight back effectively was profound. The medical challenges of desert warfare created horrors that exceeded anything Aldric had witnessed in European campaigns. Wounds that would have been survivable in temperate climates became death sentences in the heat and dust of the desert. The lack of adequate medical supplies and clean water meant that even minor injuries frequently developed into fatal infections. The screams of dying men became a constant background noise that haunted the dreams of survivors. The economic realities of crusading warfare gradually became apparent as the campaign dragged on without achieving its objectives. The costs of maintaining an army in hostile foreign territory were bankrupting the European nobles who had financed the expedition, while the promised rewards of conquest remained elusive. Many knights found themselves trapped in a war they could neither win nor afford to continue, facing financial ruin regardless of the campaign's ultimate outcome. The religious justifications that motivated the crusade began to seem increasingly hollow as the brutal realities of the campaign undermined any sense of divine purpose. Priests who had preached about holy war struggled to explain why God was allowing his chosen warriors to suffer such devastating defeats and losses. The systematic failure of prayer and religious ritual to provide practical solutions to military problems created a crisis of faith that affected even the most devout crusaders. The treatment of prisoners and civilian populations during the crusade revealed new depths of brutality that shocked even veterans of European warfare. The cultural and religious differences between Christians and Muslims were used to justify atrocities that went beyond military necessity into the realm of systematic dehumanization. Aldric participated in interrogations and executions that employed techniques specifically designed to humiliate and terrorize enemies whose religious beliefs were portrayed as demonic perversions requiring extreme measures to correct. The psychological toll of prolonged combat against competent enemies began to manifest in ways that no amount of training could have prevented. Knights who had maintained their sanity through years of European warfare began showing signs of what would later be recognized as combat fatigue. The constant stress of facing death from skilled opponents while operating in an alien environment created mental breakdowns that rendered experienced soldiers completely ineffective. As the crusade entered its second year with no clear prospect of victory, Aldric found himself confronting the possibility that all his years of training and experience might prove inadequate to the challenges of this campaign. The systematic degradation of his humanity that had made him so effective in European politics and warfare was creating psychological vulnerabilities that his enemies were learning to exploit through their own forms of psychological warfare. The realization that he might not survive this campaign, and that his death might serve no meaningful purpose beyond satisfying the political needs of distant rulers, forced Aldric to confront questions about the value and meaning of his existence that he had successfully avoided throughout his previous service. The boy who had been systematically transformed into a weapon was beginning to understand that weapons could be broken just as easily as they could be wielded. The third year of the crusade brought a catastrophic turn of events that would shatter whatever remained of Aldric's faith in the feudal system that had shaped his entire existence. Duke Mortimer fell gravely ill with a fever that the camp physicians couldn't treat, leaving the crusading force without effective leadership at the worst possible moment. The rival nobles who had been held in check by the duke's authority immediately began maneuvering for control of his forces and territories, viewing his impending death as an opportunity for advancement rather than a strategic disaster. Aldric found himself caught in the middle of these succession struggles, as various claimants attempted to secure his loyalty through promises and threats. Sir Roland the Merciless, Duke Mortimer's nephew, offered him substantial land grants in exchange for supporting his claim to the duchy. Lord Caspar of Ironhold threatened to have him executed for treason if he failed to transfer his allegiance immediately. Lady Morgana, the Duke's bastard daughter, proposed marriage arrangements that would legitimize her own political ambitions while providing Aldric with nominal independence. The political maneuvering that ensued revealed the true nature of feudal loyalty as nothing more than a series of temporary contracts based on mutual advantage rather than any genuine bonds of honour or duty. Knights who had sworn sacred oaths to serve Duke Mortimer until death were now actively plotting to divide his territories among themselves before his body was even cold. The elaborate ceremonies and religious rituals that had supposedly bound them together were revealed as meaningless theatre, designed to mask purely mercenary relationships. Aldric's position became increasingly precarious as he attempted to navigate these competing demands while maintaining his own survival. His reputation for ruthless efficiency made him a valuable asset that each faction wanted to control, but it also made him a potential threat that could justify elimination if he aligned with the wrong claimant. The skills that had made him indispensable to Duke Mortimer were now marking him for death in a political environment where yesterday's allies had become today's enemies. The collapse of military discipline that accompanied the succession crisis created chaos throughout the crusading army. units that had maintained some semblance of organisation began fragmenting as individual knights declared for different claimants, or simply abandoned the campaign altogether to pursue their own interests. The systematic desertion of common soldiers, who had no stake in the noble power struggles, left the remaining forces critically undermanned and vulnerable to enemy attack. The Saracen commanders, recognising the opportunity presented by Christian disunity, launched a coordinated offensive that caught the feuding Crusaders completely unprepared. The Battle of Wadi al-Malik became a rout that destroyed any remaining pretense of Christian military effectiveness in the region. Aldric watched in horror as knights who had survived years of combat were cut down by enemies who had learned to exploit the psychological and tactical weaknesses created by internal political conflicts. The retreat from the Holy Land was a nightmare of military incompetence and human suffering that exposed the complete bankruptcy of the feudal system's approach to warfare. The competing noble factions continued their power struggles even as they fled from enemy pursuit, sacrificing military effectiveness to personal ambition. Supply lines collapsed as different groups hoarded resources for their own use, leaving common soldiers to starve or fall victim to pursuing enemy forces. Aldric's survival during this catastrophic retreat required him to abandon every principle of loyalty and honour that had supposedly defined knighthood. He systematically betrayed former allies who had become liabilities, stole supplies from dying comrades, and used his knowledge of military operations to negotiate safe passage through enemy territory in exchange for intelligence about Christian battle plans and remaining strongholds. The sea voyage back to Europe was a floating charnel house, where the remnants of the crusading army slowly died from disease, starvation, and despair. The ships were so overcrowded with refugees that basic sanitation became impossible, creating conditions that bred pestilence throughout the fleet. Aldric watched men who had once commanded respect and fear reduced to begging for scraps of mouldy bread or fighting each other over access to contaminated water. The religious crisis that accompanied this military disaster was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the entire experience. Priests who had preached about divine favour and holy victory found themselves unable to explain why God had abandoned his chosen warriors so completely. Many lost their faith entirely, while others developed theological explanations that blamed the Crusaders themselves for sins that had supposedly invalidated their divine protection. Aldric's own relationship with religious belief underwent a fundamental transformation during this period of suffering and failure. The elaborate theological justifications that had made his years of brutality psychologically tolerable were revealed as sophisticated delusions designed to make atrocity bearable for those who committed it. The God who had supposedly blessed his violence against heretics and rebels was either powerless to protect his servants or indifferent to their suffering. The economic consequences of the failed crusade became apparent when the surviving ships finally reached European ports. The massive expenditures required for the campaign had bankrupted most of the participating nobles, while the complete lack of plunder or territorial gains meant that these debts could never be repaid. Entire noble families faced financial ruin, while their creditors began legal proceedings to seize whatever assets remained. Aldric returned to a Blackstone keep that was already being contested by rival claimants to Duke Mortimer's estate. The castle that had been his home for over 15 years was now occupied by strangers who viewed him as a remnant of the previous regime rather than a valuable retainer worth preserving. His attempts to negotiate continued service were met with suspicion and hostility from nobles who suspected he might have secret loyalties to competing factions. The social transformation that had taken place during his absence was profound and irreversible. The feudal system that had created and sustained him was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, unable to adapt to changing economic and military realities. The elaborate hierarchies and ceremonial obligations that had once provided structure and meaning were being replaced by naked power struggles, where survival depended entirely on individual cunning and ruthlessness. The peasant populations that had once submitted passively to feudal authority were beginning to organize resistance movements based on their experiences during the nobles' absence. Years of exploitation and abuse had finally pushed them beyond their capacity for endurance, while the evident weakness and disunity of their former masters had demonstrated that the feudal system was not as invincible as it had once appeared. As winter approached and Aldric faced the prospect of genuine homelessness for the first time since childhood, he was forced to confront the reality that his entire life had been wasted in service to a system that had never valued him as anything more than a useful tool. The transformation from innocent boy to hardened killer had served no purpose beyond enriching masters who would discard him without hesitation when his usefulness ended. The irony was inescapable. After decades of inflicting suffering on others in the name of feudal stability and divine order, Aldric now found himself experiencing the same powerlessness and desperation that had characterized the lives of his countless victims. The wheel had turned, and the predator had become prey in a world where mercy was a luxury that nobody could afford. The winter of 1266 found Aldric living as little more than a brigand in the forests surrounding what had once been his domain. The elaborate social structures that had defined his existence for 3 decades had collapsed so completely that survival now depended on the same predatory skills he had once used to terrorize peasant communities. The irony was not lost on him that he was now employing techniques perfected during counterinsurgency operations against the very system that had created him. His band of followers consisted entirely of other displaced knights and men-at-arms who had found themselves abandoned by the feudal system's collapse. These weren't romantic outlaws fighting for justice, but desperate men whose only marketable skills involved the systematic application of violence. Their targets were the merchant caravans and tax collectors, who served the new power structures emerging from the chaos, but their methods remained unchanged from their days of legitimate service. The psychological adaptation required for this transformation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Aldric's new existence. After decades of operating within clear hierarchical structures, where authority was unquestioned and orders provided moral justification for any action, he now found himself making decisions based purely on pragmatic considerations of survival and profit. The elaborate codes of conduct that had supposedly governed knightly behaviour were revealed as luxuries that had only been possible when supported by institutional power. The forest hideout, where Aldric established his base of operations, was a crude fortification built from salvaged materials and designed primarily for concealment rather than comfort. The living conditions were barely above those of the peasant hovels he'd once despised, with inadequate shelter, primitive sanitation, and a constant struggle to obtain sufficient food and clean water. The contrast with his former lifestyle was a daily reminder of how quickly fortune could change in a world without stable institutions. The recruitment of new followers required Aldric to abandon any pretense of maintaining military discipline or moral standards. Men who joined his band were motivated purely by desperation or greed, and their loyalty extended only as far as their immediate self-interest. The careful psychological conditioning that had made feudal armies effective was impossible to replicate without the institutional support systems that had sustained it over years of training. The intelligence networks that Aldric established to identify potential targets and monitor enemy movements were based on corruption and intimidation, rather than the systematic administrative structures he had previously relied upon. Local tavern keepers, merchants, and even some clergymen provided information in exchange for protection, or shares of plunder, creating a web of complicity that made his operations possible while ensuring that every participant was vulnerable to betrayal. The tactical challenges of conducting successful raids without the logistical support of a formal military organization forced Aldric to develop entirely new approaches to planning and execution. His targets had to be carefully selected for their wealth and vulnerability, while avoiding those with sufficient protection to make attacks too costly. The timing and coordination required for these operations demanded improvisation skills that his formal military training had never emphasized. The economic realities of brigandage were far more complex than simple theft, requiring sophisticated understanding of trade routes, seasonal patterns, and political relationships that affected the movement of valuable goods. Aldric had to function simultaneously as military commander, intelligence analyst, and business manager, while maintaining the personal relationships necessary to fence stolen goods and convert plunder into usable resources. The legal status of his activities existed in a grey area created by the collapse of traditional authority structures. While technically outlawed by whatever nobles claimed jurisdiction over specific territories, his band operated with the tacit acceptance of local populations, who often benefited from their attacks on tax collectors and other representatives of oppressive authority. This ambiguous position required constant negotiation an adaptation to changing political circumstances. The religious justifications that had once made violence psychologically bearable were no longer available, forcing Aldric to confront the moral implications of his actions without the protective framework of institutional ideology. The priests who had once blessed his campaigns and provided theological rationalization for atrocity were now either dead, fled, or serving new masters who defined his activities as sinful rather than righteous. The social isolation that accompanied his outlaw status was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of his new existence. Cut off from the elaborate social rituals and hierarchical relationships that had provided structure and meaning throughout his adult life, Aldric found himself increasingly unable to form genuine human connections. The paranoia necessary for survival in a world of shifting loyalties made trust impossible, and emotional vulnerability potentially fatal. The physical toll of his new lifestyle was equally severe. Years of comfortable living as a successful knight had not prepared him for the constant exposure, inadequate nutrition, and physical stress of outlaw existence. His body, already damaged by decades of warfare and the hardships of the failed crusade, began showing signs of premature aging and deteriorating health that modern medical knowledge would recognize as the effects of chronic stress and malnutrition. The psychological symptoms that began manifesting during this period would later be understood as forms of what modern medicine calls post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. Aldric experienced recurring nightmares about his victims, periods of uncontrollable rage alternating with complete emotional numbness, and an increasing inability to find meaning or purpose in continued existence. The systematic dehumanization that had made him an effective instrument of feudal oppression was now turning inward, destroying his capacity for self-preservation. The relationships with his followers became increasingly unstable, as the stresses of outlaw life exacerbated the personality disorders that years of systematic brutalization had created in all of them. Violence within the group became commonplace, with disputes over leadership, resource allocation, and tactical decisions frequently escalating into armed conflicts that weakened their overall effectiveness and security. The changing political landscape of post-feudal Europe was creating new forms of authority that were far more effective at suppressing brigandage than the traditional noble levies had been. Professional soldiers equipped with improved weapons and organized according to more modern military principles posed threats that Aldric's band was poorly equipped to handle. The tactics that had been effective against feudal forces were increasingly obsolete against enemies who had learned from the failures of the old system. As spring approached, bringing with it the increased military activity that always accompanied better weather, Aldric was forced to confront the reality that his current existence was unsustainable. The physical and psychological toll of outlaw life was destroying what remained of his capacity for effective leadership, while the changing political environment was making his traditional methods increasingly dangerous and ineffective. The man who had once commanded respect and fear throughout multiple kingdoms now found himself reduced to a desperate criminal whose capture would be celebrated by the same populations he had once terrorized in the name of legitimate authority. The transformation was complete, from victim to perpetrator to victim again, in an endless cycle of violence that had consumed everything he had once believed gave his life meaning and purpose. The spring of 1268 brought news that would seal Aldric's fate in ways he could never have anticipated. A new order was emerging from the chaos of feudal collapse. Professional armies funded by increasingly powerful monarchs who were consolidating territory through systematic campaigns against the brigand bands that had proliferated throughout the countryside. These weren't the undisciplined noble levies of previous generations, but organized military forces equipped with crossbows, early firearms, and siege equipment specifically designed to root out forest hideouts. King Edward the Ironborn had issued a proclamation offering substantial rewards for the capture of known brigand leaders, with particular emphasis on former knights who had betrayed their sacred oaths and turned to lives of criminality. Aldric's name appeared prominently on this list, along with detailed descriptions of his appearance and known associates. The bounty offered for his capture, alive to serve as an example to others, was sufficient to motivate serious manhunts by professional bounty hunters. The pressure created by these systematic hunting efforts forced Aldric's band to abandon their established hideout and attempt to reach the disputed borderlands where royal authority was still weak enough to provide some measure of safety. The journey through increasingly hostile territory required them to move primarily at night, avoiding roads and settlements where informants might report their presence to the growing network of royal officials. The physical demands of this forced march proved too much for men whose bodies had been weakened by years of harsh living and inadequate nutrition. Several of Aldric's followers collapsed from exhaustion or illness during the first week, creating delays that made their capture increasingly likely. The difficult decision to abandon sick and injured comrades demonstrated how completely the bonds of loyalty and brotherhood had dissolved under the pressure of survival. The psychological stress of constant pursuit was taking an even more devastating toll than the physical hardships. Men who had once faced enemy armies without flinching now jumped at shadows and turned on each other with paranoid accusations of treachery. The systematic breakdown of trust and cooperation that resulted made effective military action impossible, while ensuring that the group's cohesion would continue deteriorating regardless of their external circumstances. Aldric's own mental state had reached a point of collapse that made rational decision-making increasingly difficult. The accumulated trauma of 3 decades of violence, combined with the complete loss of everything that had once provided structure and meaning in his life, had created a psychological condition that alternated between periods of manic energy and episodes of catatonic despair. His followers were beginning to question his fitness for leadership, creating additional instability within the group. The encounter that would prove to be Aldric's last battle occurred at dawn near the village of Milford, where his exhausted band had stopped to rest beside a small stream. The royal soldiers who surrounded them were led by Sir Marcus the Righteous, a young knight whose career had been built on the systematic elimination of brigand groups throughout the kingdom. Unlike the corrupt and brutal nobles of Aldric's generation, Marcus represented a new type of military leader who combined genuine competence with unshakable moral conviction. The brief fight that ensued was less a battle than an execution, as Aldric's starving and demoralized followers were quickly overwhelmed by well-equipped professional soldiers operating with tactical coordination that demonstrated the evolution of military science during the years of chaos. Most of the brigands were killed outright, while those who attempted to surrender were cut down by soldiers who had been instructed that showing mercy to former knights would only encourage others to follow similar paths. Aldric himself was captured alive, though severely wounded by crossbow bolts that had shattered his left arm and pierced his lung. The irony was bitter. After surviving countless battles against foreign enemies and domestic rebels, he was finally brought down by representatives of the same royal authority he had once served with distinction. The systematic degradation of his body during years of harsh living had left him too weak to fight effectively against opponents who were younger, better equipped, and motivated by righteous purpose rather than mere survival. The journey to his execution was a deliberate exercise in public humiliation designed to demonstrate the consequences of betraying feudal obligations. Chained to a cart and paraded through villages where he had once collected taxes and dispensed justice, Aldric was forced to endure the mockery and abuse of populations who remembered his years of oppression with bitter clarity. The same people who had once trembled at his approach now threw refuse and shouted curses at the broken man who represented everything they had suffered under the old system. The trial that preceded his execution was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre designed to legitimize the new royal authority while providing closure for the victims of feudal brutality. Witnesses testified about atrocities committed not just during his brigand years, but throughout his entire career as a knight, creating a comprehensive indictment of the systematic oppression that had characterized medieval governance. The proceedings were recorded by scribes whose documents would serve as propaganda tools in the campaign to establish royal supremacy over traditional noble privileges. Aldric's final confession, extracted through methods that would have seemed familiar to anyone who had experienced his own interrogation techniques, provided a detailed accounting of crimes that spanned 3 decades of service to various masters. The systematic catalogue of murders, rapes, thefts, and acts of systematic cruelty created a record that demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of the feudal system, while justifying its replacement by more centralized forms of authority. The execution itself took place in the market square of Blackstone Keep, now under royal administration following the extinction of Duke Mortimer's lineage. The scaffold was positioned so that Aldric could see the castle where he had spent his formative years, providing a final reminder of how completely his world had been transformed. The crowd that gathered to witness his death included many of his former victims, whose presence served as testimony to the suffering he had inflicted during his years of power. As the noose tightened around his neck, Aldric's final thoughts weren't of the afterlife that Brother Mordecai had once promised to faithful knights, but of the innocent boy who had left his family's manor so many years ago. The systematic destruction of that child's humanity had been so complete that no trace of original innocence remained, leaving only the broken shell of a man whose existence had served no purpose beyond demonstrating the corrupting influence of unchecked power. The crowd's cheers as his body swung from the gibbet represented more than simple revenge. They marked the end of an era when individual knights could terrorize entire populations with impunity. The new order emerging from feudalism's collapse would have its own forms of oppression and injustice, but the particular combination of personal brutality and systematic exploitation that Aldric had embodied was becoming increasingly obsolete in a world where professional armies and centralized authority were replacing the chaotic violence of medieval knighthood. The boy who had dreamed of honor and glory had become a monster, and the monster had been destroyed by the same forces of change that were transforming medieval Europe into something recognizably modern. His death marked not just the end of one man's journey into moral darkness, but the conclusion of a historical period when being a knight truly did suck in ways that romantic literature would never acknowledge. In the end, Aldric's legacy was measured not in songs or monuments, but in the collective sigh of relief from populations who would no longer live in fear of men whose only qualification for authority was their willingness to inflict suffering on others. The age of knights was ending, and the world was becoming a slightly less terrible place for ordinary people who had endured their brutality for far too long. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.